I appreciate you all coming back. Tonight we're going to be talking about Luke again. We're going to talk about Luke and Acts. Before we get started, I've asked Ryan to lead us in a prayer, and as will be my custom, I'm going to ask for prayer requests. Is there anybody, and I made sure that Ryan has a piece of paper and a pen so he can write these things down. So, who do we need to keep in our prayer this evening? Shirley, yeah. I'm sorry?
Sullivans.
And the Sullivans, yeah. Bill Sullivan and Shirley and the whole Fryer family. Who else do we need to keep in our prayer? I'm sorry? The Lee family? Oh, that's right. No worries. Okay. You know what that one's about, Ryan? In a congregation this large, it's hard to know everybody, and it's hard to know everybody's business. So I understand it's shorthand for you to say Sullivans. You might want to give a phrase that says this is what we're praying about for the Sullivans. Okay. All right. Who else? That's it? Oh, come on.
The Osborne family.
Yeah, the Osborne family. Chris. Yeah. Yeah, Ryan was his brother? Yeah, are you familiar with that? Okay. Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, anything else? Oh, right there.
Yeah, Kira's niece was just born yesterday, and she has a heart issue that's going to be with her for her whole life. So
That's got to be scary. Well, that's something to pray about, isn't it, Mike? Are you familiar with what's going on with Jerry and his family, Jerry Elmore? Explain that just a little bit more, Mike. Yeah, I think you're right. Jerry's mom is in the hospital. Good. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. That's Edgar, right? Okay. And what's the health condition? Okay. It's their dad. It's Scotty and Mike's dad. His name is Edgar Garth, and he's having some memory problems, and he's and Allison wants attention back there. Yeah. How is Bob? I have not heard anything about Bob in several weeks. Bob Owen is do y'all know who Bob Owen is? It's
doing very little rehab at this point. It's very good.
No, it's not good. All right. Is there anybody else? Ryan, do you have the list? All righty. Thank you, sir.
Dear Lord, we're so thankful for this beautiful day that we've been blessed with. We're thankful as Christians we can come together to prepare to listen to your word brought to us and pray that we can learn much and make application as always we're needed in our own lives. Before the study tonight, I want to come before you on behalf of some of the family and friends and members here that are struggling right now. We pray that you be with Shirley Fryer and the loss of her husband. Pray that you would comfort the whole family at this time. We pray that you be with Bill Sullivan and all the struggles that he's been having with his health. We pray, Lord, that you might help him, but pray that we can also be of assistance anywhere needed. We pray that you be with the Lee family, with the loss of Noe's brother. Pray that you be with them, comfort them as well. Such a difficult time for them. Pray that you also be with Chris Osborne and his family and the loss of his brother tragically. Pray that you would comfort them and pray that they would look to you for strength. We pray that you be with the baby with the heart issue. Pray that you would be with that child, that the doctors can know what to do and that the right things can be done for that child. Pray that you may heal that child. We pray that you be with
Amen. Thank you, Ryan. Jeff told me it's 35 after and 40 after. So I'll have to remember that. Tonight we're going to be talking about basically, we're going to be looking, okay, is the font any better? I tried. This is 28. Steve told me that I might want to take it at least up to 28, so that's 28. I think all the slides are bigger now. We'll see. If you still have problems, just tell me. Tonight we're going to be looking at Luke Acts, and we're going to be basically going a little bit into the text. We're going to be outlining the text for both of them. We're going to outline Luke, and then we're going to outline Acts, and we're going to notice a few similarities between those two things. There are some themes that carry across both books, realizing again that the most prolific author in the New Testament is Luke. He's even more prolific than Paul. So when you look at word count, Luke is basically one of the most prolific, and he writes some of the most important stuff. And that's me saying that. That's not anybody else saying that. Because when you look at what Luke is doing, he's doing a historian's job. He's laying down what's going on basically in that first century. He's going to start with Jesus, the birth of Jesus, whether you think he was born in 3 BC, or if you think he was born in 0, or if you think he was born just a little bit after that. But he's going to take us from there, and he's going to take us all the way up into where Paul is going to be going to Rome. And so what you're talking about here is basically the span of about 60, 70 years, right in there. So this is probably the most important time in the formation of both the gospel, but also the church. And Luke is the only one who does this for us. We will have a lot of commentary about what's going on. We'll have Paul talk to the Ephesians, talk to the Galatians, talk to the Corinthians, and we will get snippets of what's going on. But for the most part, there's nobody else that's doing historical work like what Moses does in the Pentateuch, where we find out what's going on with the history of the nation of Israel. And we're going to end off by talking about some common themes between the two books. What I want to do is I want to start off by outlining the book of Luke and Acts. When it comes to, in the grand narrative of the Bible, I think you really have to start with the book of Genesis. And in Genesis, it says, God gives Abraham some promises. And this first promise, well, it's not the first promise, but it's one of the promises that he gives. He says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He makes that promise in Genesis, and the rest of the Bible is God fulfilling that promise. That to me is pretty significant. And one of the things that I marvel at is, if you do not think God keeps his promise, look at what he's done over the span of literally thousands of years. It's always surprising to me, and a little bit impressive, that the faithfulness of Abraham is what is getting these promises. It's one man that's really impressing God. And because of the faithfulness of Abraham, he gives these promises that we're a beneficiary of. And Paul tells us in Galatians, if you are Christ's, if you believe in Christ, if you trust in Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring. I'll go ahead and tell you, I haven't done that 23andMe to find out what my genetic upbringing is, but I don't think there's anything Jewish in it. I don't know that I have any blood of Abraham in me. But that said, we are heirs according to a promise that he gave to Abraham, if I have the faith of Abraham. That to me is pretty impressive. Luke is the story of basically Jesus to the children of Israel. As a matter of fact, it is odd when Jesus will preach to Gentiles. However, when we get to Acts, the message of Jesus is actually going out into the world. And we'll see that it goes from one place everywhere. At the very beginning of the book, Jesus is born and he's taken to the temple. And there are two characters that are there. There's Simeon and there's Anna. And one of the things that I didn't catch on to until I read one of the commentators, and he said, and the point that he was making in the commentary was this: When Luke was writing Luke, he had Acts in mind. When Luke was writing Luke, he had Acts in mind, and this is the quote that he brought up. Simeon picked up the baby Jesus in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples a light for the revelation to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel. When would this become clear to the Jews that the gospel was for the Gentiles as well? Huh? With Cornelius, yeah. And then they would talk about it at the Jerusalem Council as well. But this is something that would happen significantly after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. This was not clear during Jesus' lifetime. This was not clear, but for some reason, Simeon got it. And I think it's something that, I don't think this is a line that Luke is feeding into Simeon's mouth. But I do think that Luke is trying to point out, and he's foreshadowing here, that when you look at the ministry of Jesus, it never was just for the Jews. The plan for the Gentiles was always there. And for some reason, Simeon understood that. Does that make any sense to you guys? Oh my goodness. Go like this or go like this. Thank you. This does feel like a college classroom sometimes. Again, this wouldn't pay off until Acts. And to me, this is interesting that Luke would record this right there at the beginning of Jesus' life. Does that make sense? Again, I get exactly the same response. Okay. As we look at the book of Luke, let's go ahead and talk about just a general overview of what Luke is going to be doing in his book. In the first 3 chapters, we're going to be introduced to some characters, and the first character that we're introduced to is not Jesus. Who were we introduced to at the very beginning? Oh, my goodness, it's up there. Ladies and gentlemen, can you not read? Come on. Who were we introduced to? John the Baptist. Thank you, Jeremy. John the Baptist is the first one that we're introduced to. And it's interesting to me that they introduce first John the Baptist and then Jesus. Let me ask you a little bit about this. Why is John the Baptist introduced first, do you think? He is a forerunner, yeah. Mary and Elizabeth are basically pregnant at the same time. So these guys are basically the same age. He's a forerunner, but it's not because he's necessarily much older than Jesus. Why else do you think he might be? Anybody? This is not a professor trick. I do not have an answer in my mind. Yeah, where? Oh, go ahead, Mike. Yeah, he did. The ministry of John will precede Jesus. We're going to talk about this more next time on Sunday. We're actually going to start talking about Jesus in relationship to families. But one of the things I want you to think about just for a moment is, what did the birth of John the Baptist look like versus what did the birth of Jesus look like? Remember, who bore John the Baptist? Who was the mother of John the Baptist? I'm sorry? Elizabeth, that's right. Talk to me about where Elizabeth was in her childbearing age. She was past. A very Jewish story, that we have examples of people who have been past childbearing age having a child. Now talk to me about Jesus. Was Mary past the age of childbearing? She was very young. What did her future husband think was happening? That she had messed around. One of these looks like a scandal, and one of these looks like a miracle. And Jesus didn't look like the miracle. Do you see that? And this starts developing a theme that will happen all throughout Jesus' ministry. The things that you expected are not the things that are going to happen. You keep on waiting for this king to come and save you, who is going to beat up on Rome. But the problem is, Rome is going to start off the kingdom of heaven, and Rome is still going to be in power when the kingdom of heaven is here. As a matter of fact, we made some reference to the book of Daniel. Do you remember the dream in Daniel where there was this statue? What was the point of the statue? How many different kingdoms there were going to be? And again, I said this last time, I'll say this again. I think if you want to understand the New Testament very well, you really have to have a pretty decent grasp of what's going on in Daniel. Because Daniel's going to tell you a lot about what's going on in the intertestamental period, but he's also telling you a way of looking at this. And what happened to that statue? It broke, but what broke it? There was a rock that came and destroyed the statue. And the statue itself was made up of different metals, gold, silver, bronze, okay. And then you got down to iron and clay at the very bottom. And each one of them represented a different kingdom. And you just think about this for a moment. You've got this statue made up of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. And what destroys it? A rock. What do you think that rock is going to do to all earthly kingdoms? I think so too. I think that this rock, whatever this kingdom is going to destroy every other kingdom. To me, in my mind, if I'm in that time, I'm thinking, finally, getting rid of all these earthly leaders and all these corrupt earthly kingdoms, we are going to have, finally, the world rule of a godly kingdom. That's what I would be waiting for. I would be just like Peter with a sword, waiting to fight the battle that had to take place. But that's not what the kingdom of God was about. Okay, my goodness, let's get through the intro, why don't we? We will meet his family in chapters 1 through 3, and then we will see his lineage. We're going to talk about his lineage a little bit. There's a difference between the lineage of Jesus in Luke and in Matthew. And we're going to talk about why there are differences between those two. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I kind of like about Matthew that Luke doesn't do is Matthew will actually name the women, some of the women in Jesus' lineage. Luke won't. And we'll talk about that difference when we get there. The second one is that Jesus starts beginning his ministry in chapters 4 through 8. And this to me is very interesting because this will not be where most of his parables will be. His parables will mostly be up until about Luke 18:19, starting with Luke 9 and then going to 18:19. And that's where most of the parables that you remember are going to be housed. Right here, he's going to begin his ministry, and he will do things like send out the 70 and things like that. In chapter 6, Luke will record his version of the mountain message. And you're going to see some differences when you look at what Matthew writes in Matthew 5 versus what Luke writes in Matthew 6. How do we deal with those discrepancies? The message is going to be somewhat different. When we look at the Beatitudes are going to be different. They're not all different. As a matter of fact, one of the things that you're going to notice is that Matthew lists more. Luke lists fewer. So there's a difference there. But why do you think there's the discrepancy?
He's being
I'm sorry? It might be because who's being written to. My suspicion is this is not the only time Jesus preached this sermon or series of sermons. Have you ever known a preacher that just has a meeting series? And they will go from one congregation to another congregation, and what will they pull out? The meeting series. This is what I'm going to preach here. This is what I'm going to... As a matter of fact, when we talk about this one, we're not going to call it the message on the mountain. We're going to talk about the message on the plain. Is this a different telling of the same event, or is this a different version of him giving the same sermon in a different place? I don't know. I think it's a great question. When we get there, we will actually talk about that discrepancy a little. We might. I'll go ahead and say, and I've neglected to say this last time, I'll be teaching Sunday and Wednesday, and then we're going to rotate. The other three teachers are going to be Micah. Where are you, Micah? There he is. Jerry said that he would do some, and yeah, Jeremy. And Jeremy right back there. Those are the other guys that are going to be tackling this. The other thing that I'm going to say here is Luke is going to pay special attention to women, and I want to talk specifically about Luke 8, where he talks about who is financially helping him on his ministry. That was a handful of women that were doing exactly that. And then from chapter 9 through 19, and this I did not recognize until I listened to, have any of you listened to the Bible Project? If you haven't been listening to the Bible Project, you should. It's really very well done. But one of the things that they did when they divided up Luke, they talked about Luke's journey to Jerusalem. And I didn't realize how many times between the chapters of 9 and 19, there's some phrase in almost every chapter that says, while Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And what happens in Jerusalem? Oh, when we get to Jerusalem, that's where he's crucified. I was listening to another commentator talk about this section, and he said more than likely, Jesus was probably a frequent visitor to Jerusalem. That when you look at where things were, a lot of Jews had to go into Jerusalem and out of Jerusalem for different things. And that Jesus probably had the same relationship. But this is a storyteller, not telling a fictitious story, but he's showing you how he took his mission, his gospel, eventually into Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, that's where they're going to kill him. And then he's going to be resurrected in chapter 24. All right. I asked you at the very beginning of this, did anybody outline the book of Luke? Oh my goodness. I gave you the perfect opportunity. This works for me, but let me go ahead and talk to you a little bit about the book of Acts. Because in the book of Acts, chapters 1 through 3, and I didn't mention this, but oh my goodness. that didn't save. Okay. Let me tell you, there's a section in Acts where it basically lays out everything that's going to go on in Acts. And it talks about how it would be first preached in Israel, and then it would go to Asia Minor, and then it would go to the world. And that is exactly what happens in Acts. And really what you're seeing within the book of Acts is basically one or two messengers, starting with Peter and then going to Paul. And basically, it's following mostly Paul's journey to do exactly what Jesus did. Preach the message, be accepted by some, be rejected by others. That it's the same story, it's just on a bigger scale. And by the way, when you look at the character of who Paul was, what was the pedigree of Paul? What was his background? I'm sorry? Tribe of Benjamin? Studied at Gamaliel's feet. What does that mean?
Well, he was a highly regarded Jewish scholar.
He was a smarty pants. He was really smart. He was really good. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And at that time, Pharisees were the thinking man's Jew. Look, we talk about the Jews and the Sadducees. We talk about the Pharisees and Sadducees. How large were these sects of the Jews? Huh? Teeny tiny. I read this a long time ago, and when you read the writings of Josephus, one of the things that he said was, and he actually put numbers on it, but when you look at it, potentially 5% of the Jewish population were Pharisees. 5%. So if you had 20 Jews in a room, maybe one of them might be a Pharisee. Sadducees, how big was that sect of the Jews? Even smaller. From what I understand, what you're talking about with Sadducees, you could probably number them in the hundreds or maybe a couple of thousand. Were they talked about a lot? Yeah, but why were the Sadducees talked about a lot? They were the ones who had made the deals with Rome. And because they had made the deals with Rome, they were the ones that were in charge of the temple. Because Romans were interested in taking charge of the temple because they recognized not only was this the religious center of the Jews, this was also the political center of the Jews. This is where they received law. This was the most important part. This was the most important place to the Jews. And Rome wanted that. They wanted to be in control of the thing that was most important to that people. They made sure they were. Let's go ahead and look at a few consistent themes. Here's one of the most consistent themes in my mind, is an unlikely messenger gives an unlikely message. And we just talked about the pedigree of Paul. Here you have a Jew of Jews. How would you use him? He's got all the connections to all the most powerful Jewish leaders. So how would you use him? How does God use him? He sends him where? To the Gentiles. Does that make any sense at all? Look, one of the things that I said before is that God is going to confound our wisdom by doing it the way he wants to, not the way we would. And he does. He takes one of the most prominent Jews of the day and sends him to the Gentiles. The main character travels to the capital city and then is unlawfully imprisoned. In one case, he would be killed. In another case, he will be sentenced to death. The effectiveness of prayer and joy in the face of difficulties. And one of the things that you look at Mary's Magnificat when she finds out she's going to be the mother of Jesus. And the stigma that's going to place on her, because everybody's going to see, including her husband-to-be, is going to think that she has been unfaithful. Mary knows better. Joseph knows better. And we will all eventually come to the conclusion that she had to put up with a lot, but it turned out to be a blessing. And then you can see Simeon basically having joy, seeing Jesus. And then in Acts we see joy with Paul and Peter and all of them when they are put on trial, unjustly accused. This is what would bring them joy. And in both of these, we see the reconciliation of God. No, I might go into that. We've only got a few minutes left. One of the things, and this is just me, I think one of the things that's important in my mind is sometimes we think about heaven as a great real estate deal, that you're going to have a giant mansion. Look, the most important part of have you ever gone on a trip with the wrong people? Really? Am I the only one? Nobody else has gone to a beautiful place with the wrong people. Okay, thank you, Judy. Yes. What's wrong with going to a beautiful place with the wrong people? What happens to your memory of that place? It's ruined. I will not name the names, but when I was in college, I took a trip with a bunch of friends. I hope they're still friends. To Washington, D.C. It was the worst trip I've ever been on. I took the wrong people. They fought about everything. They fought about what we would watch that night, where we would go to dinner. They fought about everything. It was a beautiful place with the wrong people. Look, the thing that makes heaven heaven aren't golden streets, isn't a pearly gate. The thing that makes heaven heaven is the one who loves you the most of anybody you've ever met is there, and he's waiting for you. He has given everything he can to reconcile you with him. I think it is far more important that we are reconciled with God than we have a home in heaven. Because I think God has given so much. Now that said, I recognize I'm making an academic distinction. That heaven is where God is. Got it. But I know some people, and you probably do too, they want to go to heaven, but if only God were not there, they would like it even better. I know those people. And what I would have to tell them is this: you're looking at heaven all wrong. The one who loves you the most is wanting you to come. All right. The other theme that I want to talk about very briefly is what we call the upside-down kingdom. Here's some characteristics of the upside-down kingdom. This is not my nomenclature. I didn't call it this. This is really a lot of different scholars have called it this. But when you look at the upside-down kingdom, one of the things you notice is there are a lot of things that are different about God's kingdom versus an earthly kingdom. That the nature of power is different. God doesn't force us to do anything. God persuades us to do things. And the most interesting part to me is God could force us to do anything. He could have made us robots. He could have made us somebody that just obeyed every whim of his will. But he didn't. Instead, the nature of God's power is persuasion, influence. By the way, that's what he still asks us to do. The role of the poor and the marginalized. And you'll notice that this comes up in Luke 6. It also comes up in Acts chapter 10. That it's not the powerful, it's not the generals, it's not the people with the most authority. It's the people that are poor. It's the people that are the outsiders and the marginalized. Those are the people who see it first. Those are the people who usually understand the kingdom first. The role of forgiveness, mercy, and grace versus getting what you deserve. We've said this before, I know we have, where I am so glad God is just, but I am overjoyed that he is merciful, because I don't want what I deserve. And the idea of material wealth versus spiritual wealth. It's always struck me that when you look in the Old Testament, you have somebody like Abraham or Job or Isaac. These guys are rich. And then you get to the New Testament, where you've got Jesus and Paul. And was there anybody wealthy in that crowd? I want to argue that if you look at their bank statements, you're looking at the wrong measure. That both of these were wealthy when it came to spiritual wealth. And that's a better indicator of how wealthy you are. And then the role of love and selflessness. How important it is to be selfless, not selfish, not seeking after personal gain. Okay. I think that's basically everything. You think that's done, Denise?
Yeah, I think so.
Denise says I'm done. I guess I'm done. I've talked way too much. I apologize. What are some comments or anything that you guys would want to say? And by the way, anytime I do this, you're welcome to raise your hand. You don't have to listen to me prattle on. Joe.
Yeah, I think Luke also points out in chapter 1 where he shows Gabriel standing at the right side of the altar
first time in 400 years, over 400 years, that God has now spoken.
You're right. And he uses Gabriel. Again, we talked about Gabriel last time when we were talking about it. He shows up in Daniel, and then he shows up here. I guess he's got to be getting up there in age. So
I think that's an important aspect.
I think so. I think
Bring the forerunner, preparer.
yes, that's exactly right. What other observations? And this ends my introduction of Luke. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Paul, as a prominent Jew, would have had great influence over Jews. So, as you pointed out, sent to the Gentiles. But that would help the Jews realize that God wanted the Gentiles accepted, because one of their most prominent was accepting the Gentiles.
Yeah, you're exactly right. When you look at most of the epistles, though, when you look at Ephesians, when you look at Galatians, when you look at all those, the problem, and Romans, but most famously Romans, the problem that all of these gospels, not gospels, all these epistles are trying to deal with is Jews and Gentiles, that distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and they are no longer distinct. That's the problem they're going to deal with for about 50 to 100 years. They will eventually get it, but it'll take them a while. But no, that's a good point. Anything else? Was I that good? I know better than that. Next time, I will say this. I think I accidentally left up the QR code, and yeah, those are the wrong ones as well. Okay, let me tell you what I'm going to be doing next time, and I just know this. What we're going to be looking at next time is we're going to be looking at chapters 1 and 2, and we're going to be basically looking at Jesus and his relation to his family, to family in general. We're going to make some observations mostly about John the Baptist. I said this at the very beginning, and it's one of the things that I love about Luke, is he probably has the fullest treatment of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, the line that I always remember about John the Baptist is, he must increase, I must decrease. I don't know many people, I don't know many men, I don't know many people who recognize that their time is gone, who recognize that they need to be sunsetted, who recognize they need to be eclipsed, who recognizes that their role is not to be the one that is the most important. He's the one who is a transition from to. A lot of people have problems with that. That wasn't John. John understood his role, and that is something that I really appreciate. The other thing that I appreciate about John, he goes all the way. He will not survive his ministry in Jesus on earth. So he is completely committed to God and to Jesus, and nothing's going to stop him. So anyway, we'll pick up there. Did anybody listen to the book? Not just from me, but did anybody listen? Huh? Okay. And by the way, any Bible app, almost every Bible app has an audio Bible now. Listen to it. I want you to listen to how many times Jesus predicts his own death. I want you to listen to how many times Jesus is called the Christ before they recognize him as Christ. Then I want you to notice, when you listen to it, how poorly everybody acts around him. They keep on messing up this message, and it's usually the people who are the closest to him that mess it up the most. There's something that I say in class occasionally, which is, I promise you this is true. The bitterest fight you've ever had is with the person you love the most. So anyway, thank you for your kind attention.